Nowadays, getting any reading done feels almost impossible. You've got work, family obligations, and by the time you get everything done, there's no more time left over to read and educate yourself. Sound familiar? Well, I've been there too, but over my years as a published academic, educator, and entrepreneur, I've developed an approach to reading that has helped me read over 1,000 books. And in this video, I'll teach you a 3-part framework for reading that will actually help you read one full book per week. Starting with part 1 of this framework. Read multiple books at once. Now, I know this sounds like it makes no sense at all, and that if anything, it's only going to overwhelm you more than you already are. But hear me out, because the truth is in fact the complete opposite. Not only will reading multiple books at once increase the number of books you'll ultimately read per week, but it'll also make reading a whole lot easier. And here's why. Imagine you're driving on the highway, but it's one of those parts of the highway with one lane that goes either way. Now imagine you're driving along and you suddenly find yourself stuck between another driver who's driving really slowly. Okay, so you know what that's like, right? Well, what usually happens in this situation? Not only are you now stuck behind this person who's going super slow, but now everyone who's behind you is forced to slow down to your pace. And so if there are 4 cars on this road, every car, including you, has to slow down and follow the pace of each car in front of them. But what if I told you this sort of pattern is exactly the type of issue holding you back from reading at least one book per week, and even possibly more? You see, if you're anything like me, you're constantly adding new books to your reading list. And in fact, you're probably adding them at a faster rate than you can actually read them. Yeah, you know what I mean. And so consider the current book you're reading. Well, no matter how fast you're reading your current book, literally every book on your list that's behind the current book you're reading has to wait until you're finished with that book. In other words, just like our 4 cars, they all have to slow down to the pace you're reading your current book. But then how does reading multiple books at once solve this? I mean, you took grade school math. Reading multiple books at once simply splits your reading time up among multiple books instead of one. There's no more time that magically appears out of nowhere, right? Well, let's revisit our traffic example again. Imagine that instead of a 1-lane highway, we now put all of these 4 cars onto a 4-lane highway. Suddenly, each car can now move from behind each other car and shift into one of any 4 lanes. As you're well aware, now each car can drive at its own pace and reach its destination at its leisure. And although this isn't a perfect analogy, here's the real reason this speeds up your reading. You see, I don't really know exactly how many books I've read up to this point, but it's at least comfortably over 1,000 books. And something interesting I've noticed at this point in my reading journey is that there are certain books I'll tend to be able to breeze through quickly, certain ones I'll have to read more slowly, and still other books that I'm able to read at a pace that's somewhere between the pace of those other 2 types of books. And as you read more and more books, you'll start to realize the same thing. Out of any 4 or 5 books you're reading at the same time, you'll start to realize that there are maybe 1 or 2 of these books that you can read and absorb far more quickly than the others. There are maybe 2 or 3 others you'll be able to read at some moderate pace, and there should be usually at least 1 of those books that you might spend a really long time on, maybe weeks. But the point here is that because you're reading multiple at once, you'll be able to quickly spot which ones you can cycle through faster in this process and which others you have to spend more time with. And while the time it takes to get through your reading list will theoretically be the same, you'll get through certain books on your list faster than you would have otherwise, meaning you're probably already capable of getting through 1 book per week. You just need to allocate your reading time more effectively. Okay, this all sounds great, but then how exactly do you identify which type of book is which, and also how to fit this kind of reading into a busy schedule? Well, that's where part 2 of this framework comes in. Identify reading priority. The key to making this approach to reading work to its maximum efficiency is to cycle through those easier books on your list as fast as possible. But the problem is you don't know ahead of time which ones are going to be faster, slower, or medium paced. And so once again, after tons of experience having read all sorts of books, here are 4 signs that consistently appear that strongly suggest a book is going to be a faster read than others. 1, it's a structure you're used to. 2, it's a structure that is inherently simpler. 3, the information you need from the book is more limited. And 4, you find yourself obsessively interested in the book, which can honestly go either way, but I'll explain. How to schedule your reading counts a lot for whether you can get through at least 1 book per week. But let's understand each of these points first, and then actually understanding how to properly schedule your reading will make a lot more sense. So 1 here really only emerges after you've been reading consistently for a while. For instance, when I first started reading analytic philosophy, it was almost impossible for me to get through it, let alone get through it quickly. Now, although it might objectively be harder than a lot of other material, I'm so much more used to the structure, terminology, and so on that I can read passages in this field a lot faster. The same goes for comparing my current ability to read research studies in psychology versus when I first started reading them. The important question to ask yourself then is, which kinds of books or topics do you find yourself able to read more quickly simply because you're more familiar with the topic or structure? Whatever those are, be sure to add books of these types to your reading schedule because those might be among your fastest reads. Number 2 here sounds like a similar point, but here's what I mean by inherently simpler. There are certain books, such as self-help books or even a lot of finance or pop science books, that are designed to be consumable for the widest possible audience. Because of this, their structures are fairly predictable. A claim, followed by a story or example, followed by a restatement of the claim, followed by the next claim, and so on. And so even if you aren't currently a fast reader, these are typically great books to start with because they'll naturally build your reading speed, which takes us directly to number 3 here. You see, as you read certain books, for example, let's say the great book Chaos by John Gleick, you might realize something like, I went into reading this book thinking I wanted to learn all about chaos theory, but now I realize it'll be good enough if I can just get a basic understanding of it. Have you ever realized something like this as you were reading? You see, it's actually okay to breeze right through certain parts of a book, such as certain examples or stories, or even not finish a certain book altogether, as long as you clearly define to yourself what you wanted to get out of the book. You won't always know this from the start, but try to identify it as you read so you can keep dynamically shifting your reading priorities. But now, that brings us to number 4 here, which, as I said before, can actually go both ways. Have you ever picked up a book, started reading it, and started to realize the topic was way more fascinating than you thought, and you became almost obsessively interested in the book, sometimes to the point that you couldn't put it down? Well, if you're an avid reader, you might understand what I mean when I claim that this could go both ways. You see, either you're so obsessed with this book that you're gonna be compelled to read through it at a faster rate, or the exact opposite could happen. You could become so fascinated with the book that you take your time, reflect, review, and you actually dramatically slow down your reading of the book. For instance, there have been books I've read in the past that I initially expected to breeze through, but then I suddenly started to realize, whoa, this is incredible stuff. I need to take lots of notes as I read. I need to make my own commentary on those notes as I read. And I even should go back and review certain parts again, reflect on them, and discuss them with others so I can solidify or even dispute the ideas. And so, are you starting to see why it's so important to read multiple books at a time? I mean, you'd never be able to engage in this kind of sifting and sorting process with books if you read only one at a time. But the question remains, how can you organize all this activity, especially with a busy schedule? Well, that's precisely where part 3 in this framework comes in: scheduling and reading tactics. So I currently read at minimum the equivalent of 1 book per week. And I know this because at the end of each month, I'm typically done with anywhere from around 4 to 8 books. And although I now have a flexible schedule, it wasn't always this way. I used to run an academic test prep agency full time, and of course, like everyone else, I had tons of other obligations. And so, although in all transparency, I do spend quite a bit of time each week reading, I still used to average about a book a week when I was running that agency. And so I'll share with you what I was doing at that time. Essentially, I scheduled 15 to 20 minutes into my calendar here and there for reading. And typically this was 15 to 20 minutes in the morning and then 15 to 20 minutes during lunch or after dinner. But what did I do in those 15 to 20 minutes? I typically read 10 minutes of one book and 10 minutes of another book, twice per day. But the key was how I read. You see, you might have heard of the tracer method, but if not, it's simple. As you read, simply trace your finger under the text you read. And guess what? This is incredibly effective. Essentially, it prevents your eyes from wandering all over the page as you read, often called saccadic eye movements, and allows you to process the text faster. And usually this effect is instant. Another tip I teach my students for fast comprehension on timed tests is called scanning. Now, this method is especially useful for identifying which parts of the page you should read fully and which parts you can breeze through or even skip. How this works, and you can use this method with or without a tracer, is that you pour your eyes over the text. You just barely read, and instead you try to have your eye catch repeated words, phrases, or themes, and from this infer what this chunk of text or paragraph is about. From there, you can make a quick executive decision on whether you want to read this more fully or whether it's something you can breeze right through. And although these aren't the only reading and scheduling tactics you can use, these are the ones that I've seen work not only for me and for colleagues I've worked with, but also for so many of my students who have gone on to achieve top scores on their entrance exams and top grades in their coursework. But the most important part here, which parts of this framework stood out to you the most? What is one component of it you'll start implementing into your own reading schedule so you too can start reading a minimum of one book per week? I'd love to hear about it in the comments, and if you want to keep leveling up your critical thinking to make a massive impact, not only on your own life, but also on the lives of countless others, then be sure to watch this next video.